The technical name for it is semi-quincentennial, but you can just call it America's 250th birthday. I'm Mark Webster, and this is a Family Life News special report, America at 250, how we got there and where we're headed. As we celebrate the official signing of the Declaration of Independence, we're going to take the next half hour to journey together with a trio of experts into the underpinnings of the world's definitive experiment into governance by and for the people. I'll be joined later by my Family Life News colleagues Sarah Harnish and Bob Price, each of whom interviewed experts with unique insights into the formation of our nation. But I'll bat lead off. Our first guest is Grove City College Professor of Education and Humanities, Dr. Jason Edwards. And we begin before the beginning. As we talk about the United States formation, its Christian faith roots, go all the way back to before the Revolution. The Puritans, it seems like they certainly would have had a hand in shaping that because they're the Puritans. They were all about their faith.
That's absolutely true, particularly in the North. The Puritan culture that they established is still obviously having an impact. I would turn as well to the First Great Awakening, which is more widespread than just the Puritans, but is really making the 13 colonies, has revived their sense of Christian mission, and just the widespread adoption of Christianity has occurred in particularly the 1730s and the 1740s throughout the colonies, and is really setting the culture that ultimately is going to lead to independence.
Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of debate even this year over whether our founding was intentionally deeply Christian. Was it secular? Does the truth lie somewhere in between? What do you think?
The easy answer, I guess, is somewhere in between, but frankly, I think it is much more Christian than it is anything else. You even have the easy comparison, the French Revolution, which occurs shortly after and even shares some of the same people and characters, is clearly an anti-religious event, even an anti-Christian event, and it really shapes the nature of that revolution, where I think the American founding is fundamentally a Christian event and really can't be understood apart from Christian terms. Unfortunately, I don't think some of the founding fathers are Orthodox Christians, but the culture that they're swimming in and the philosophy that they're approaching is much more informed by Christian morality than it is by anything else.
Mm-hmm. That gives me a good segue into maybe examining a few of the larger-than-life figures of American history. We'll start with Thomas Jefferson. Pretty complex guy, real Renaissance man, knowledgeable on many topics. And one of the things in terms of faith that he's remembered for is his Jeffersonian Bible. What theological insight does that and maybe some of his other actions give us into where his faith was at?
As you said, he is a complex individual. I think it's a little unfortunate how much he's known for the Jefferson Bible. If anybody listening doesn't know, he did unfortunately go through the Bible, specifically regarding the Gospels and regarding Jesus. He thought Jesus was the best man who had lived. He thought his morality was an essential and best morality in world history, but he did struggle with the notion that Jesus was God. So he went through the Bible and took out the parts of Jesus performing miracles and identifying himself as God, and so was just trying to take his morality. So that's not a wise thing to do, but at the same time, and to be fair to Jefferson, he did not publish the Jefferson Bible. The Jefferson Bible isn't published until the 20th century. This was something that he was doing, which I think, to be more generous or fair to him, is that this is a brilliant, complex man who lives a long time and lives through tragedies and wrestles with his faith and wrestles with his understanding of Christianity. And so his actions reflect a person taking their faith seriously and wrestling with their faith much more than someone trying to attack Christianity or advocate for a different position.
He's certainly not the only one to ever struggle with exactly what to do with Jesus. That's one that continues to this day. Let's go on to Benjamin Franklin, another pretty complex guy, gifted founder, did so many things. We all know about the kite and all that, but from reading about him over the years, he seemed to have a respect for Christianity, but maybe not in what you'd call a devout way.
Absolutely. All the founding fathers really identify. I mean, Jefferson identified as Christian. Some of his beliefs are unorthodox. Franklin comes from, you mentioned the Puritans, really his parents. He comes from a very devout background. He largely does reject that faith for himself personally, but he certainly doesn't disrespect the faith. And he's another one who lives a very long time, and his mother and his sister encourage him to continue to take the faith seriously, and he wrestles with it. He is, by all accounts, really legitimately good friends with George Whitefield, the most prominent evangelist of the era and a key voice for the First Great Awakening. He's definitely not hostile to Christianity, and is another one who, in terms of moral teachings, believes that Christianity is where we get our morals from and is an advocate for that, though he's not orthodox in some essential elements of Christianity.
Mm-hmm. I'll squeeze at least one more in here. George Washington certainly is a compelling figure. He seemed to, from what I've read, have a deeper Christian faith than, say, Jefferson or Franklin, though he wasn't exactly outspoken about it.
That's right. Washington is generally considered of the giants, on the one hand, easiest to prove that he seems to have a deep and probably orthodox faith, but George Washington is, kind of the original marble man, if you will, and just his deep sense of decorum. He's not particularly vocal or writing down clearly, but certainly Washington is a faithful church attendant and takes Christianity very seriously and would certainly identify as a Christian. But he's not a evangelical preacher either. Just fits with his personality that he's more silent.
Stoic kind of guy is how he's usually portrayed.
Exactly. There you go.
We've talked about the big names, the heavy hitters, if you will, of the founding of the nation. Let's talk about clergy, the role clergy and the Christian church played in the American Revolution.
I think they're crucial. Some historians, when we look at the founding and think of the big names that we just covered of the founding fathers, they obviously have an education and they're definitely impacted by Enlightenment thought, but the common education for the vast majority of Americans comes from the church, and they look to their ministers who are well educated, as well as really they establish the culture, and they were overwhelmingly supportive of the founding and are really necessary because you are in a Christian culture, and so Christianity emphasizes that, well, you're supposed to, in most cases, be following authority, and God has placed your political leaders in those positions, and so you are to respect that authority unless they are doing something that's directly against God's higher authority. And so it's the ministers that are really emphasizing to the people that that's the situation that we are in, that the king and the parliament are not living up to their God-given authority, and so we have to follow God over our current situation and establish a government that is following God's authority and God's teaching. And so the churches were a place for recruitment of men to fight and for funds to facilitate the war. And I think if the clergy did not support this very long war and effort, you're just not going to have victory and independence. The odds are definitely against the Americans.
Mm-hmm. In its opening paragraphs, the Declaration of Independence references the laws of nature, nature's God, and later says endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And of course, near the end, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Providence seemed to be the popular term there as opposed to referencing God directly. How does all that wordage reflect what the founders might have been truly thinking in terms of the role of faith in our founding?
Well, I think they're identifying it as essential. It may be language reflecting the popularity of Enlightenment thought as well, but these are men who identify as Christian, who are Christian, and who throughout the Declaration of Independence are again saying that we need to justify what we're doing, and we do that because we are trying to follow God's teachings and God's standards accurately, and He is the divine judge of the world, and that's what we are facing, and that it's ultimately in God's hands, and so we're going to trust in His providence with the results.
To try to wrap it up, and you could take this whole topic in a million different ways, but the question that still is with us to this day, given what we know about the founders and what they wrote at the time, what they did, was the United States founded as a Christian nation?
I like that you say it can go in a lot of different ways, and so with that specific question of is it a Christian nation, ultimately I'm going to come around to say yes. Initially, frankly, what I would say is no, but not for the reason that people might think. I think the bigger question there is, are they creating a nation? I might argue that they're creating a confederation of states, And if you look at their state constitutions, these are very specifically Christian. And so I might actually take issue with the term nation more than Christian. But in terms of Christian, it is an overwhelmingly Christian. It is specifically Protestant. That is the American culture. That is what's informing the founding fathers, both the powerful ones and the common man. Is the Constitution that they ultimately create, is it specifically creating a Church of America? No. If that's your standard, then I suppose you wouldn't say it's a Christian nation, but just as I don't know the laws of or what has been established in Israel, but it's a Jewish nation. It's very obvious to me that the United States is, in almost any way that you could understand the term, is yes, that it was founded as a Christian nation. And our struggle now is that you, as John Adams and others reference, you have a government that is created for a Christian people. And if we're not a Christian people, then that government will work less and less effectively for us because it was designed for Christian people. To my mind, we need to return, and I hope for revival for the country, but to have that, we need to return to the faith of the founders.
Grove City professor Dr. Jason Edwards. You're listening to a Family Life News special report, America at 250, how we got there and where we're headed. Up next are Sarah Harnish, who spoke with historian, author, and the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale College, Dr. Bradley Birzer. They focus on the specific roles New York and Pennsylvania played in the founding of our nation. And they begin where it all began.
If you were waking up in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776, what was going on outside your window?
Oh, so much, especially if we're walking down by Independence Hall. Just amazing to think about all of these men who came together for the Second Continental Congress. And Sarah, one of the most important things that I think we often forget as Americans, the Second Continental Congress is not exactly legal. Nobody gave them the sanction to do it, but it's so utterly American that Americans would simply choose their representatives and go down and meet in a hall and pass something like the Declaration. They had no right to do that, and yet they had every right to do it. This day, 250 years ago, would have been just an amazing moment, truly a historical moment in which I would argue that eternity for a moment enters into time.
What role did New York and Pennsylvania play in the founding of America?
Let me put them together for a moment. Both as middle colonies are critical because you've got the kind of pride of the New England colonies, and then you have an equal pride of the Southern colonies. And those two don't always get along. And it really takes New York and Pennsylvania to be the moderate colonies and to tie everything together. Plus, when we look at what's going on in both of those colonies, the wealth of New York and the wealth of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, they're really providing so much of the American economic engine for what's going on that allow us to challenge this great empire of Great Britain.
And I know for a while New York was loyal to Britain. What would America look like if Britain had won?
What a question. I don't know exactly. I think, as Edmund Burke said, neither Britain nor America would look like Britain or America anymore. If we imagine what it would have taken for the British to actually take out American farmers, remember, probably 95 to 99% of Americans are farmers. They're very heavily armed. And so the British really would have had to have practiced genocide against us, and they weren't willing to do that.
Tell me the story of two of your favorite heroes, one from New York, one from Pennsylvania, that you think deserve more recognition as patriots.
The one person from New York who did not get recognition for years until the musical came out is Hamilton. I love Hamilton. I don't agree with a lot of his politics. In fact, his politics are very much not mine, but I respect him immensely for his dedication, his loyalty. He was an incredible officer during the war itself, a great aid to George Washington and a great comfort to George Washington. From Pennsylvania, there's so many people to pick from. Ben Franklin, John Dickinson, James Wilson, but I have to go with John Dickinson. Dickinson is one of my favorite guys, and if you've ever seen that musical 1776, he's kind of the bad guy in that because he doesn't vote for independence. But it's not that he's against independence. He's all in favor of it. He just believes that we have to create a constitution first before we declare independence. So I don't like making him the bad guy. Some scholars have said he was the great penman, Penman, of the revolution. And I think along with John Adams, that's absolutely true.
If you could erase one myth about America's founding, what would it be?
Well, that it was a tax revolt. And I don't like taxes either, but we often think it was a tax revolt, but it was really a revolt against taxation without representation. If it had been a tax revolt, it was a great failure because once America became independent, our taxes went way up. But what we often forget, and this is a truth I'd like us to remember, we often forget that so much of American anger was directed towards the British interfering with our law courts. And that's really what begins the revolution. Britain was attempting to impose admiralty law, which is naval law, on land. And we were a deeply common law people. We believed in a right to a trial by jury, the right to habeas corpus, the right not to have excessive bail, all of these things that are deeply rooted in the common law. And that's what the Americans were really upset about.
What primary source on American history do you wish that more people would read, even as adults, even if we're not in college anymore?
Yeah, one of the great things about the founding is all of the documents were made to be read out loud. Every one of them. They are not meant to be complex or esoteric. They are meant for public consumption. And so everything from the Declaration to John Dickinson's Letters of a Pennsylvania Farmer, they're all meant to have a rhetorical flourish. And Jefferson's draft of the Declaration even has intonation marks on it to indicate where the speech should speed up or should slow down. So I love that. But the one document I think most Americans have forgotten is Dickinson's 12 Letters of a Pennsylvania Farmer. Just a beautiful description about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a patriot.
What one single early American event, either in New York or Pennsylvania, do you believe most changed the course of American history?
Let's put it this way, and it's going to sound strange, Sarah, because it's a failure. But when George Washington evacuates Long Island, he is absolutely, no exaggeration, he is the last guy off the island. He is watching British troops march inevitably towards him, and he makes sure that every other soldier is safe. It's a failure. We had to evacuate. And yet, when you think about George Washington's character, that he would, as the commanding general, be the last guy off the island, that just gives me chills every time. What a man of integrity. Just incredible. That, to me, that idea of George Washington, what a blessing he was for us. God truly, truly graced us with that man.
If you're just joining us, I am news anchor Sarah Harnish, and with me is Dr. Bradley Birzer, a professor at Hillsdale College. And this is a special feature. We are doing a deep dive on how New York and Pennsylvania contributed to the birth of America. Dr. Birzer, the U.S. Constitution is the oldest written national constitution still in use in the world. It is incredible what was accomplished in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, setting up a bicameral legislature and Congress with representation by population and equal representation, a president with term limits, the U.S. Supreme Court, checks and balances, states' rights, protecting things that were unprotectable at the time in Europe, like the right to bear arms, free speech, protected faith. It seems like it was divinely led. The amount of ground that they covered in just a few documents has stood the test of time for 2.5 centuries, and it still applies with precision today. They made a list of grievances about Britain, and then they built a system to outsmart what had failed. What are your thoughts?
Oh, Sarah, you put that so beautifully, and you summed it up perfectly. Everything that the Constitution was able to accomplish it is an act of providence. I have no doubt about that at all. There's no doubt that when we look back, I think this is one of the things that we often forget about the founding, especially liberal historians who want to focus always on the Enlightenment, the kind of secular element of the founding. When we look at the founders, those men who were at the Constitutional Convention, 99 out of 100 of them were devout Protestants. They believed so utterly in the Word of God, And you think about Protestantism and the genius of Protestantism, the two things that help so much in founding a republic. Protestants are automatically skeptical of authority, and because they read their Bible, they're literate. We're talking about a population in 1787 that was the most literate population in the world. What a combination. I get very frustrated when people say, oh, the Christianity didn't matter. It mattered completely. There is no doubt about that. These were absolute men of faith. And yes, there were people like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin who were skeptical, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Rush, but they're the minority. They're powerful people, don't get me wrong, but they do not represent America in the least at that point.
You've got 1 hour. If you could only go to a single historic site in New York or Pennsylvania, what would you say is the most important for the nation's founding?
Oh, yeah, that's an easy one. And I probably am giving a really rote answer, but definitely going to Independence Hall. Just to think about everything that was decided there with the Declaration and then the Constitution, and to think about Pennsylvania being one of the great colonies in and of itself, even separate from America. To imagine in that little block right there, so much of the world changed. If I could go back, and of course historians love playing this game, if we could go back and see any one moment, who wouldn't want to be there at the signing of the Declaration or on September 17th of 1787 with the signing of the Constitution? What a brilliant moment to be there. I thank God every day for being born in this country, knowing that we really are meant to be his chosen people, that he has blessed us.
Our Sarah Harnish with historian, author, and professor of American Studies at Hillsdale College, Dr. Bradley Birzer, on the pivotal roles played by New York and Pennsylvania before, during, and after the American Revolution. You're listening to a Family Life News special report on America at 250, how we got there and where we're headed. Up next, Bob Price with our final segment. He spoke with Tim Barton, president of Wall Builders, a name taken from the Old Testament story of Nehemiah, who led a grassroots movement to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and restore its strength and honor. Wall Builders proclaims a similar mission, seeking to inspire Americans to become involved in strengthening their communities, states, and the nation.
We have been the most free, the most stable, prosperous, and benevolent nation in the history of the world. And for the last 250 years, we have actually done some pretty exceptional things. From an objective perspective, America really is a unique and special nation. On top of the fact, most nations don't last 250 years. When we were birthed, it was the era of revolutions and empires were rising and falling. Most nations don't last 250 years.
Yeah.
And we've had one constitution since 1787. Our constitution is 239 years old. The average length of a constitution in world history is 17 to 19 years. We are the most stable, the most free, the most prosperous of any nation in the history of the world, and we should celebrate it.
There's a poll out from the Cato Institute. Probably doesn't surprise you since you do this for a living, but our civics knowledge as a nation leaves a lot to be desired, and that's putting it nicely. A majority of Americans, 53%, do not know why the United States celebrates the 4th of July. Are you surprised by that statistic, Tim?
Well, sadly, no. I'm disappointed by it, but I'm not surprised by it because I have seen over the last many decades the failure of the modern academic system. What we celebrate on the 4th of July, of course, we declared our independence from Great Britain. It's when 56 men join together. They do the Declaration of Independence, and most Americans have learned generally about the Founding Fathers, and so we have general ideas and impressions, and that's why a lot of Americans, they actually think the Founding Fathers were not good men or honorable men, that they certainly weren't godly men, is the perspective. And you can only have that perspective when you don't even know who they were. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration, most Americans couldn't even name 5 of them, much less do we even know their stories. So I'm not surprised because a lot of the modern narrative that we've come to believe today not only is incorrect, it's pointedly and intentionally at times incorrect to disconnect people from the reality reality of the goodness of what God did in this nation and of how many founding fathers openly acknowledged faith, depended on God, so that we could become a nation. So, no, I'm not surprised, but certainly I'm disappointed.
Well, you probably get asked this question a million times, make it 1,000,001. Was America founded as a Christian nation, Tim?
I think depending on how we define that, because obviously there's always this nuance of what does that mean, but I would say what is very, very clear is the founding fathers overwhelmingly were men that identified as Christian. The number one quoted source in the founders' writings was the Bible. The most significant voices leading up to the revolution, it was actually the pastors. Where did the founding fathers get their idea? It was the pastors. And again, these are things that are historically documented. If you think about logically in America, what is the major event that happens in America before the revolution? That's the First Great Awakening. Pastors that are leading a revival. The very first time the founding fathers ever met was September 6, 1774. The opening motion from the first meeting was that they opened with prayer, and the records of Congress indicate their opening prayer lasted for 2 hours. So when you look objectively big picture, were they people saying, if you're not a Christian, you can't live in America? Well, no, of course not. But these were Christian men who rallied together, and actually throughout the entire American Revolution, they had every single year, sometimes more than once a year, they called on all 13 colonies to join in days of prayer and fasting to ask for God's intervention, for God's help. George Washington actually at Valley Forge, he encouraged all the officers to make sure that you are checking yourself spiritually, because as important as it is to be a patriot in these moments, it's far more important that we are Christians in this moment. This is George Washington.
Correct me if I'm wrong. George Washington was a deist, correct?
No, he was not a deist.
Okay, because I've heard that that's what he was.
So that is one of the modern narratives today. But what I can tell you is there's a very famous painting of George Washington kneeling down in prayer at what's believed to be Valley Forge. Anybody listening right now, you can just pull out your phone, do a basic search. Did George Washington pray? And what you will discover is not only did George Washington pray, there are multiple eyewitness accounts from military officers during the Revolution that document they would often find him by himself in prayer. And part of why, again, this matters is deists, they do believe in God, but deists don't believe that God gets involved in the world today. George Washington not only was an active prayer throughout the Revolution, every single one of his generals that talked about his faith described him as a outspoken Christian. And if you go to the end of his life, when he dies, he and Martha had adopted two of their grandkids to come live with them. One of them is Nellie Park Custis. And Nellie Park Custis, at the end of his life, she writes an amazing letter. She goes through all of his active faith things he did in daily life, where he had a devotion every morning for an hour. He'd go in and study and read his Bible and pray. She goes through all these anecdotes of his faith, but she concludes the letter. Should I have to avow to anyone that the general was a Christian? Sooner should we question his patriotism than his Christianity.
Wow.
And nobody's going to question that George Washington's a patriot. And this goes back to the point that we know names and we don't even know their stories. Because we don't know their stories, there's a lot of misconceptions we believe about them that if we actually went back and studied their story, read their writings, and even listened to people that knew them tell the stories about them, everyone that talked about George Washington's faith described him as a Christian.
You mentioned up front that there aren't a lot of countries that make it to 250 years. I'm wondering, what's the secret sauce to our staying power as a country?
Yeah, I think what has made America unique and different for so long is part of the foundational principles the founding fathers outlined in the Declaration. Is they said, we believe fundamentally there's a God, that our rights come from God, and the primary purpose of government is to protect those God-given rights. Most nations of the world, they've had struggles for power and who gets to decide and who makes the rules. And in America, the question of who decides was fundamentally answered by the founding fathers, and it's God. In every nation civilization, there's only two options. You either have a really big God or you have a really big government. And the bigger your God, the less government you need, because you have a system of morals and a code. And the more secular we have become, the more instability we have suffered through, the founding fathers laid a foundation where they said religion and morality are the indispensable supports that we cannot function without this. But it's because, and this idea where people say, yeah, but separation of church and state, or we shouldn't have God and government. If there is no God, there are no God-given rights. So if you have a government who rejects the notion of God, then they therefore have to reject the notion of God-given rights. And that means then government gets to tell us what our rights are, what we can do and what we can't do. And that is fundamentally opposed to the foundation of the birth of the nation. We were birthed on an idea that not only is it true biblically, but the founding fathers said even for a nation, we are birthing this thing on an idea that there's a God, that our rights come from him. They don't come from the king. They don't come from the government or president or Congress. They come from God. And government's primary role is to protect those God-given rights. And it's those principles upon which this nation was built that have helped us over time to be the most free, stable, prosperous, and benevolent nation in the history of the world.
Got one final question for you, Tim. You've been very kind with your time today. A lot of folks are asking this question at America 250 is, can this nation survive another 250 years? Will we make it to 500 should the Lord tarry? What do you say to that, Tim?
Well, I think John Adams answered that question. There's a letter he wrote to a militia in Massachusetts in 1798. It's a great letter. It's only 5 paragraphs. You should look it up. Anybody listening right now, do it. 1798, John Adams' letter to the militia of Massachusetts. But in it, he has this really famous line where he says that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. The founding fathers believed what they were building was giving freedom to the people, but they knew freedom only works if you have a religious and moral people. Because if you give freedom to immoral people, all they do is immoral things, and then it looks like Chicago on a bad weekend, right? That's not a good thing.
Yeah.
And so what they said is that you have to maintain religion and morality. And actually, they were clear, and many of their writings, they identified that religion was the religion of Jesus Christ, which is Christianity, and morality was derived from the teachings of the Bible. What they're advocating and what they advocated was without Christianity and the Bible, this freedom experiment won't work. And so what I would say is, can we remain? Well, that really depends on if we as Americans can turn back and restore the religious and moral foundation, because if we do that, then freedom can maintain. But the more secular we become and the more we lose the idea of who decides, who's really in charge, if God's not in charge and we decide to put man and government in charge, ultimately it will continue to erode freedom. So the way we maintain for the next 250 years is we have to once again restore the principles of Christianity, elevate Jesus once again in this nation, in our hearts, our minds, and our lives. And if we restore that foundation, I do believe freedom can remain.
Tim Barton, president of Wall Builders. Our thanks to him, Dr. Bradley Birzer of Hillsdale College, and Dr. Jason Edwards from Grove City College for sharing their insights on America's past, present, and future. On behalf of my colleagues Bob Price and Sarah Harnish, this is Mark Webster for Family Life News. Thank you for listening, and have a blessed Independence Day.